everyone. It's great to see you on here, and we're really looking forward to our event with AJ Gnuse and Leah Hampton. I am Jackie at Hub City Bookshop. You can see in the background, I'm at the bookshop right now, and we're really grateful to have both of these wonderful authors with us tonight. Probably have a few more people come online as we go. Remember, there's lots of fun question features in Crowdcast. I'm just going to do a little run through of that, and then I'll introduce the authors. So first, you can ask questions, of course, just in the regular chat, or you can just tell us where you're from or make comments about either of the books or the authors. We'd love to hear from you. There's also an Ask a Question button right in the center bottom, and you can actually vote on people's questions. If it's a question that you also want to ask, you can hit a little vote up arrow button, and we know who wants to know the answer to that question, so that's fun. And also, you can buy Adam's book right with that little green button at the bottom of the screen. It should be flashing for you, and that will take you to Hub City's website. And we do have signed copies of the book. They're actually on the way, but within the next 24 hours, we will have signed copies of the book. So we're very excited about that. So a little introduction for you guys. First up, I'm going to introduce AJ Gnuse. So a native of New Orleans, he received an MFA in fiction from UNC Wilmington and was a Kenyon Review Peter Taylor Fellow. His short stories have been published in Gulf Coast, Guernica, the Los Angeles Review, Passages North, Potomac Review, and other magazines. Girl in the Walls is his first novel. He lives in Texas, and that's where he's joining us from today. Very happy for these virtual events where we can gather from all over. So speaking of, Leah Hampton is in North Carolina. She writes about Appalachia, corpses, eco-anxiety, and smart women. Her debut collection, Fuckface and Other Stories, was released by Henry Holt and was named one of the best books of 2020 by the Paris Review, the New York Public Library, Slate, and others. A graduate of the Missioner Center for Writers, she has been awarded multiple prizes and fellowships, including UT Austin's King Prize for Literature and the Philip Roth Residency at the Stadler Center for Poetry. Her work has appeared in Ecotone, Guernica, McSweeney's Electric Literature, Story South, Lit Hub, and many others elsewhere. She lives in the Blue Ridge Mountains near the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and we're very grateful for both of you for taking the time to meet with us today. I'm going to toggle off my video, and I think Adam or AJ, he goes by either, is going to go first for us today.
Thank you so much for joining me, Leah. It's awesome. I'm getting a little bit of feedback right now. I might need to, I'm going to actually just jump out of these headphones real quick.
Or you sound fine to me.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Actually, I'm getting so much feedback
that
I'm going to go back on the headphones.
Ooh.
But, okay.
Ooh, that was
I'm just going to listen to my own echo.
That was a really good introduction to your book. It was such a spooky sound.
No, yes, that's kind of what I'm hearing the whole time here, but I'll just feel the vibe the whole time. So if I look frightened, you know why.
Okay.
So I'm thinking it would be best just to kind of just introduce the book first for anyone who isn't necessarily just fully familiar with it. Girl on the Walls is the story of 11-year-old Elise. She's an orphan who's escaped from foster care, and she's returned to her family home. The problem is that there's a new family living there. So she does the reasonable thing. She sneaks in, she gets into the attic, she's able to get into the spaces between the walls through the holes in the attic floor, and she sneaks out when the family's away and steals food and other supplies as she needs it. She's kind of living in this holding pattern, just not really know what to do in the state of her grief. And ultimately, the family that's living there becomes increasingly aware that the sounds that they hear in the middle of the night, the shapes at the end of the hallway, might actually be a person. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read just a really short passage. It's just a page and a half. And I'm excited about reading this passage for kind of, I feel like it has some things similar to what Leah's doing, and I'm excited to talk about that in a bit. But in this passage, we're getting the perspective of Eddie. He's a 13-year-old boy. He's the youngest of the Mason family, and he is hanging out outside after he gets home from school because he's the one that's become, the most aware that these sounds might be a person. So he's kind of avoiding going inside. And this chapter is called Swamp Creatures. On the other side of the levee, river water rose. For months, as the snow melted up north, the small runs of water fed into streams, swelling half-iced creeks, sloughing downhill, weaving over rock and sand and padded mud over the days and weeks down into the Mississippi. With it, the brown river ballooned, as it had every spring until it pushed up against its border levees, swallowed the thin batcher, and submerged the cypress trees to their slender bellies. When the air cooled in the evening, green river frogs and southern toads, large as a man's fist, emerged from the water's edge and leaped in short bounds up the concrete side of the levee. They crested the levee, plunging into the grass, then down across the road and into the mason's yard. Eddie marched along his trail between the willow and the oak even after the sun set. 12 and a half steps to the roots of one tree and 12 and a half back made 25. There and back 4 times made 100 steps. He wore knee-high rubber boots he had received this past Christmas, the ones he wore every afternoon in the backyard, even though his feet had already grown until his toes pinched and it had become a chore to pull the boots on and off. Everything changed in time. Eddie adjusted his pace in order to step over a toad that had appeared in the mud of this trail. A skink wormed over the bark strip root where he had planned to step and pivot. Hard to keep focused on his own mind when the world beneath him teemed and wriggled on its stomach. Eddie, his brother's voice, if you're still out here, Mom says, come inside. The back door slammed shut. It was getting late. Eddie had been out here since he had come home from school, counting his steps and imagining himself as a knight. The black field had become overgrown with yellow thistle, and while he had paced that afternoon, the stalks had been spiked creatures, his enemies, peering at him above the tall grass, plotting as he prepared his castle's defenses. Too old to think like that, he knew. He hadn't done any of his homework, even though there was less of it now with the school year nearing its end. Eddie looked over at his house, gone gray in the dusk. His father was a shape passing through the office window. A lamp blinked on. He had to go inside now. Eddie realized he'd been avoiding it. Hurry the hell up, his brother's voice again. She won't let off me until you get your ass in. The grass rustled in the field behind him. Shadows leaped throughout the yard. When Eddie pulled open the screen door, he found a lizard caught in the netting. Its limbs twisted in the screen, and its yellow eyes lolled. Skin dried to a dark brown. He couldn't tell if the animal were dead or looking at him. Thanks.
He couldn't tell if the animal was dead or looking at him. Can we just all sit with that line just for a second? Because I love that line so much. And I remember reading that line for the first time whenever I read this book. Hi! How you doing? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So, Adam, that was beautiful. And thank you for having me and for helping me once again celebrate Hub City and independent bookstores. And everybody make sure you're buying your books from your indie booksellers. Tell us a little bit, after having read that, and this will kind of lead us into our discussion. Tell us where did this strange and so compelling book, where did it come from? Like, just give us a little origin story, and then we can maybe talk some more about your work.
Right. So there's like a number of different origin stories that have kind of like all come together to make this, because there's all these different threads. And I'm sure that's the case for like a lot of authors as well. Just so many different parts that are fitting into it. But one big part of it is that I wanted to write a very place-centric novel. Like, I loved having the restriction of just like a singular location, and in many ways just like a house that you had to learn so much about the place that it almost became like, you know how like in fantasy books they put like the map in front of it and then you have the world laid out in front of you. I wanted that same kind of feel, but it to be, you know, a realistic setting that we're all kind of experiencing in our everyday lives, like a house. But yeah, just kind of like set it in the place, and then having the perspective of someone who never leaves this house because she's living in the walls, to kind of run off with that.
And is it, and so, and you were born in New Orleans, like this is a city you know well, you know these kinds of houses well, because this is such a labyrinthine house that she lives in. And it really resonated with me, especially because obviously we've all been stuck in our house the last year. But this is something that, so the place of New Orleans and the place of this kind of classic New Orleans home,
Mm-hmm.
What's your experience of those places?
Right. So it's very similar to the house I actually grew up in. I grew up in this really weird neighborhood. It's like technically New Orleans, but if you're there, you look around, you're like, this doesn't seem anything like it. It's very rural. It's right along the river. So there's this big levee. There's like, we had to deal with wild hog in our backyards. I'd get home late from like a job, and I'd get chased in by pigs all the time, and just really resented those pigs after a while. But yeah, it's this incredibly strange neighborhood. It's in this incredibly strange house in this neighborhood where it's beautiful, it's stunning. It's also like kind of, a kind of hodgepodge of different styles. There's a lot of different love from a lot of different families that put into it. It's an incredibly creepy house as well. There's all sorts of strange noises all the time. The acoustics are just absolutely strange. Like cruise ships going down the river sound like they're coming from your closet. There's just thumps in the wall you just get used to. There's a lot of points where, like, as like a 12-year-old boy, I'm sitting at home and I hear footsteps upstairs, and I'm like, I just gotta cope with either the supernatural or someone's here, or I'm just gonna turn the volume up louder on the TV.
Yeah,
so it's strange in that way.
And it's so, like, because obviously New Orleans is such a storied place. Like, it's so indicative of stories that we know about New Orleans and about the South in general, and just like the sense of, were you thinking about the larger southernness as you were doing this, or about feral hogs? Let's talk about some feral hogs.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, and I was working on this in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is like weirdly similar to the ecology of New Orleans. In some ways, it's totally different, and in some ways, it really felt like I was home in fun ways and like suspicious ways where I was like, I thought I'd left. But yeah, the kind of something that was really important for me this book was incorporating this strange environment, because you can't just have a house and put the boundaries of the house like that. They're too permeable. The environment's playing a big role, even though we have like a thermostat on, and we have insects coming in all the time, just living in the South. Like, it's just going to happen. It stinks. And I felt like you couldn't have a story without incorporating this sense of the outside world, just to kind of show that, like, okay, your restriction of the house, like, you're going to have to break that a bit because it's impossible. And I love that about your writing too. It's just because there's like this simultaneous story of the natural world happening with the people world, or like, it's not a simultaneous story, because sometimes it's like the same story happening, where you can't have a story about people without the story of like the quote unquote natural, because like people are nature too, right? Like, right. The vision's different.
Right. And I mean, I feel like this book can't take place anywhere else than New Orleans, even though it feels so universal and you so appreciate this girl's situation. Is it so? Can we just list like all the way, because I'm curious, when I asked you about origin story, can we talk about how gothic this book is? Because I tweeted about this yesterday, about this concept that you and I invented, because we're geniuses, yesterday, about eco-Gothicism.
I'm happy to jump on credit.
But it's so, like, when I first was reading it, I was thinking like, oh, Shirley Jackson, I'm vibing with this. But then I started to really unpack how truly Gothic it is, because it has all these markers of that kind of, when we think about Southern Gothic, you have, well, and even really traditional Gothic, right? So we have a castle, right? We have a maiden. We have, I mean, I don't want to spoil anything, but we have a male villain who comes in. We have, and in that kind of Southern Gothic sense, there's the freak, there's the transgressive, there's this interrogation of the same things that you're celebrating, right? Of like,
Mhm.
there's it's so Southern and it's so New Orleans, but it's also obviously so angry at those things and recognizes how problematic so much of the South and, these kind of the white supremacist kind of tropes of the South and Southernness. Like, your book gets all that, right? And but it's so straightforward. And but then there's also this environmental aspect that is really, really important to this book. And so, like, I don't even know how to frame this as a question other than, like, right? Like, you did that on purpose, right?
Yes. Yeah. And absolutely. Like, when people want to talk about origin stories, they generally like want to talk about, like characters, and
Yeah.
weirdly for this story, it was very much just like place and kind of my experience of the place, and just really interested in just an exploration of like how many different perspectives can you get in this one singular spot, whether it's, the perspective of a lizard caught in like the netting, or it's termites like working their way in, or it's a girl who's hiding out in the walls. But yeah, I love like how you were really like honing in on the elements that are Southern Gothic as well as traditional Gothic. Like, I didn't even think about like the maiden quality, or like the villain who's like weirdly in love, at least with the
Architecture is a
idea.
big feature. Yeah, in Gothic literature.
Yeah, the
Sorry, keep
architecture,
going.
absolutely.
I was validating. Keep going.
Yeah. And thank you. But yeah, getting into the idea of like the Southern Gothic, like with where it's a place that's steeped in the past, it's got all this element of decay in it. There's this weird sense of like love because it's this. You said this yesterday, and I absolutely love it. And I love it. I've been thinking about it like all day, where it's we have this kind of, I guess it's a cliche, but it's a valuable cliche, where it's place as a character. And you said it's not actually like a character. Probably it's not really like that in Southern literature. And I don't think it's really the case in either of our writing, like what you're doing in Fuckface and what I'm doing with Girl on the Walls, because it's too big just for a singular character. It's something that's a part of every single character in the story. It's what they're interacting with, it's what they're fighting against, it's who they are to a certain degree. Yeah, and like when you're writing stories, are you going into it with kind of like an environmental focused, or like what is the crux for you? Like, what's the starting, the inciting point for you when you're doing, like, when you're thinking of all these different stories that you're writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think for this book, for Fuckface, yeah, absolutely. It was, years ago, my first job out of high school was working for Greenpeace, and I've always been kind of a nerd and a tree hugger. And I'm very aware, as a person who lives like on the outskirts of a national park, I'm very aware of these things. And so yeah, I thought of it as not a character, but the central tension of the book. The engine of the book is, ecological breakdown. And so you said a really important word, and this is a word that's really true of all kinds of Gothicism, but especially Southern Gothicism. And this is something I didn't know I was doing. Well, I knew I was doing it, but I didn't know how much I was doing it until you and I were talking about this, and until I read your book, which is that concept of decay and how important that, because, I worship at the feet of Truman Capote and Carson McCullers. Like, those are my very first two back in the day, oh my God, I want to be a writers. And they really are all about the breaking apart and the falling apart and the decay and the kind of intentional rottenness, right, of the very things that they're celebrating. And I think what's happening in my book and in your book is this merging of all these like really, and I mean, I'm writing about Appalachia, which has sort of a different, it's like a, subset of Southern literature, if you will. So there's some other things going on with folklore and, some other conventions, but really, in essence, it's like this combination of decay and the Anthropocene, right? The crisis of ecology of the 21st century, because both of our books taking place within, recent memory. And I didn't want to write about, grannies and 1920. And I feel like all those books there are people who do those books way better than I could. In the same way that when I started your book, I didn't want it to take place in, 1880 with somebody trapped in some old house. I mean, I know it's an old house, but they have TVs and you know what I mean? And so I really appreciated that it's this merging of what is happening right now environmentally and how that eco-anxiety acts upon all of us, dovetailing really well into into our reason, into you and me just kind of experiencing the Southern Gothic, I think, right? I mean, is that stuff kind of what you grew up with?
Yeah, so I guess, and it's weird, like looking back on like what was I particularly drawn to, and it's interesting to like look back at the books that were really important to you and just figure out like, okay, so why was I so drawn to them? Was it, emblematic of something I was experiencing? And yeah, I was drawn a lot, like the books that just light off in you and just feel like they're just electric in your hands, like, In Cold Blood, where it's just like, whoa, oh my gosh, you just got shocked by that. Or Carson McCullers too. And there is, I think, something that speaks particularly strongly to where we're at about, the Southern Gothic, the sense of decay, the sense of like the world is, something you're in love with, it's around with you, it's troubled and it's problematic, and it's also slightly ominous. Like there is something going on very bad in the world right now. We all know it. It's not just the South.
We cannot control
the planet.
Yeah, and we can't control it, but we can,
Yeah, kind of.
There's this thing. And the other thing that I think is really important to your book and to mine is humor. Like there's a darkly humorous quality to, the absurdity of the scenarios in this book. That like, you get two teenage boys that are fighting over Legos, and there's like this 11-year-old girl stuck behind a desk. I mean, these are ridiculous things, right? In the same way that Ballad of the Sad Cafe is a ridiculous situation.
Right.
Capote's short stories are all these like bananas, like children on their birthdays, and these crazy, that kind of. And I think my stuff is very dark. Like it's dark. They're not happy endings, but I think that I think the stories are hilarious. That these people find themselves in hilarious situations, and that I think that's a Gothic thing too. That because I think of Southern Gothic as taking I think of all Gothicism as pleasurable horror. As taking finding some kind of deliciousness in whatever is horrible, and there's a reward for Elise, for our protagonist in your novel. She's comfortable with this situation, right?
Yeah, I love that idea of that kind of like comfortable horror, or like I would never want to live in any horror book ever. That is just something I can feel like I haven't read every horror book, but I promise you I don't want to live in any of them. But like I would live in Jane Eyre, even though there's horrible stuff coming there. It's like this weird kind of, the ambivalence we have between these different feelings, where it's like this place is beautiful, it's stunning, it's also very dark, and there's a woman in the attic that shouldn't be in there. Like somebody let her out, dear God. But like in the same way where you're dealing in fuckface in these stories, like there's really dark stuff happening, but it's beautiful, and these characters are really likable, and they're despite all this stuff going on, they're doing well for themselves. Like they're dealing with a lot, but like they're people you want to hang out with. They're not horror characters in the least bit. It's about like home, I think, to a certain extent. It's about living in a place that is horrific, but also like dealing with the mundane and in a good way, like the day-to-day, the quotidian, like, and finding joy in that, and having to let go of certain things. So I guess that's part of it. And I'd love to ask you about this idea of like, if we are going to dub ourselves official eco-gothicists, that we're people of the members of the eco-gothic,
we're getting matching tattoos. Just so you
Yes,
know.
exactly. Just huge ones, face tattoos. But yeah, like what is, I guess the takeaway, like, I mean, it's stupid because like the stories are just like trying to entertain people, but like, but what is kind of like the feeling you're trying to instill in people by like viewing a natural and human environment in these ways?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I think because for me it's short stories, so it's 12 different stories and they sort of have 12 different purposes. I mean, I think what I'm, and I did know this when I was working, and I think you knew this too. I did know that I was writing about a place that is misunderstood, and that I was also writing about environmental issues that were and are underestimated, right? Like the environmental issues in your novel are certainly things that we know historically were grossly underestimated and underreacted to and still are, right? So I think it's about doing the same thing that the writers that we love and that we're building off of were doing, which is to represent but also quirk and kind of queerify and make strange and make and heighten what we're seeing so as to impact the reader. Like I don't want people to just, like, you can hear my cat meowing in the background. Sorry. I don't want people to just read the stories that I've written and not then have questions and not be like, well, I got to visit this place. Is it really like that? Are all the chemicals really in that river? Or is this woman really going to have butt sex? Like, I want people to kind of I don't want there to be answers at the end, that they're for you to be curious and for there to be mystery and some desire to go further with it. And I mean, I think your book is so satisfying in the way that it travels over this girl's experiences. So I don't know if you have the same thing of like opening up, but I think that feels like the key, because we're talking about aliens, right? We're talking about alienated people who this is a girl living inside the walls of the house. I'm writing about people who are living in a marginalized space, living in a space that's been that's had its natural resources stolen and damaged, and yet these are also people who even within that marginal space are marginalized, right? And I feel like that's where we're eco-Gothic, that we're interested in all the Gothic stuff, but that it's matching up with this larger purpose of noticing how that is peculiarly ecological. Is that a really long answer?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this idea of like embracing the strange, keeping it strange, because it makes you look at it, makes you kind of, I feel like if we were to focus on anything at all, like we're talking about this enough time, it's going to seem strange. And the idea of like seeing something as strange just means I think that we're like paying attention to it, or paying close enough attention to it. Like, and I love that with your book too. And I love that with this idea of in terms of like, if we're going to become more understanding of the environments we live in and the really, depressing realities that are we're looking at across the world, like we've got to get closer to this stuff. We've got to see the strangeness in it. We've got to stop seeing stuff in terms of like, oh, this forest, that's worth this amount of money, like, and that's the end of it. Like, okay, you can sell it for that property, you can turn it into a paper mill. Congrats. Like, no, the reality of a forest is a lot stranger, and it's a lot more interconnected than we knew before. And yeah, I was trying to do that with like houses to a degree, where it's like, okay, the house is an environment. It's not separate from nature. And like, we don't know what's going on in here. Like,
I mean, you've created an ecosystem within a larger ecosystem, Sorry, I keep interrupting you, but I'm so enthusiastic.
No, it's I love it. No, I love hearing it too. But yeah, like embracing the strange, and then like, also like there's the sense of decay, and I think there's also this sense of kind of fatalism, like stuff is gonna go away, and like we're holding onto this flawed place that's also slipping away, and there's this kind of longing, and one story that just you wrote that like just still kills me is Twitchell. Like it's the story of, and I don't want to, I'll just tell people what's going on here. But like it's the story of this community that's experiencing chemical poisoning. Like there's cancer rampant in it, and they're trying to live their like everyday life with this kind of beneath the surface. Some people are ignoring it. Some people are just like, yeah, it's kind of what's happened to us. But it is this it's weird thing that ties a community together, and it's horrifying. And as someone who's like living in Wilmington, and I think we have some Wilmington folks in here too, and other areas of North Carolina, absolutely, like there's a lot of poisoning going on in these environments, and it's this kind of corporate like destruction of communities, of people, of animals, of everything. Gosh, yeah, we talk about climate change. It's like there's just one part of the stuff going on.
Yeah, you said inevitability, which I think is such an important concept too, because there's a build, right? Like you have this wonderfully structured plot, and it builds, and when we roll into like Act 4, it's like okay, here we go, and it's brilliant and it's so compelling, but it's also, I think, really important to what we're talking about is this commonality between us of the fatalism and the inevitability, right? Because that does come from being a Southern writer, that like you have this, like if you know and understand what is problematic and horrifying about the South, the white supremacy and the history and the all of it, all the shit, right? You know these things, and you know that they're inevitable, and you understand the horror of it, and there is no escape, right? There is no escape from that. So how do you write stories then that recognize that reality, but that also have propulsion and universality and all this other kind of stuff that we want in fiction, right? And I think what's so great about The Girl on the Walls, what it's doing is we have the castle, and we have the maiden in the castle, and we have the ecosystem of the house, but then we have the wider ecosystem and the things that there's so many things that are out of this girl's control. And yet she takes tremendous comfort in the controls that she has, and takes tremendous comfort in being at home. And she says, this is mine, this is what I have, and I can manage this, right? And it's just so heartbreaking, this child who feels so so certain that I can make this work, and it's such a Southern thing, and it's such a Southern Gothic thing, and it's such a common refrain in meetings at the National Parks and Conservation Association I used to have, when we would talk about how the red wolf population is dying and we're trying to reintroduce it, and it's not going to work. We can't control this, right? So I don't know if this is a question about plot so much, but like, how did you have a process for managing that kind of build in your plot? How did you figure out how to make that inevitable stuff, that building, work?
Yeah, I love that question. And yeah, I mean, like a lot of it was just kind of pouring a lot of my experience and a lot of experience, other Southerns are kind of having into this book, where this feeling of you want to hold on to the home, and it's the home that you want it to be, and you wish you didn't have to like figuratively like live in the walls sometimes of it, but
right.
But yeah, there's this idea of that like it's ultimately kind of a futile effort. Like she can't live in the walls forever. That house is not going to be there forever. It's in South Louisiana, and there's hurricanes and there's coastal erosion. Like it's a football field of land disappearing every hour on average. So it's like, okay, stuff's coming. But there is this kind of joy throughout the book in Elise, the girl on the walls, in making it, in suspending yourself, like suspending disbelief hopefully for a reader, but also suspending yourself in this house where it's like, I'm going to make the impossible possible. I'm going to hold on to this thing that's disappearing, that's not even really like fully mine anymore. It's these other people's, but I'm going to make my happiness here. And yeah, in terms of ramping up the the tension in the book, it was kind of a surprise, like how much it ramped up for me. I was working along, but it was kind of just like a natural progression of like, okay, like what does it mean to try to hold on to a home in now in the South?
And it's, you know, there's something you said just now that I wanted to make sure I circled back on. This, what was it? Well, I mean, but the action, it's so strange. It's not strange, but it's admirable that even though it takes place in this one singular place, that there's so much building action. But, you know, I think it's really important at this point to say, if we're talking about the eco-Gothic thing, that neither of our books is doing this in some like flowery way. You know, you're not, like, the metaphor is so obvious, I think, in this novel. Like, I get it. So I have this incredibly straightforward prose. I mean, it's beautiful and the descriptions are nice and we like the characters, but you're not, like, I guess I'm just saying, like, there's a readability there that's maybe a shift from some Gothicism where it's like, okay, but I have a point, so I'm just going to make this really straightforward. You know, is that something you thought about in terms of just like style and flow, to have it be engaging with all these heavy ideas? Did you then make a conscious decision to have it be, I don't know the right word for this, I guess straightforward? It's a compliment, but do you know what I'm getting at? Is this something you thought
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that we both benefit from is that, like, the subject matter, the subject setting of what we're dealing with is like naturally really beautiful. So like just kind of presenting it the way it is, it's like art, in that like art is beautiful plus strange. And I've never thought of that before. I could be wrong, and it's just the way I'm like experiencing it in this conversation. But like all of this stuff is kind of naturally present in the world we're writing about, and like I think we're just trying to like show it as best we can. And those ideas, like, gosh, I feel like, thank you for like, you know, complimenting like these really complicated ideas, but you know, honestly, while working on this, I felt like they were just endemic in the subject matter. Like, what happens when you put a girl on the walls in South Louisiana and she doesn't want to leave? Like, it's like, okay, well, the themes are there, right there. And I love how you're doing that with like kind of doing a constellation across, you know, the Appalachian area, and just getting like all of these different themes. I will say that I really do admire short story writers, because I feel like there's the revving up for me is a lot of work, and I appreciate how you guys can constantly do it. And also there's this real sense of craft you can do, and that you can have so much control over all these different parts of a narrative. And it's also really scary too, because it's like I have that much control over it, while with like a novel, like you start off and you're like, okay, now I gotta do that. And I appreciate you doing it. And actually, I see Donald Sechrist in the chat here, and he's another Appalachian short story writer.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Shout outs to you guys. Absolutely.
Yeah, is it is that something that we're, because it isn't lessony, you know, like it's not, at least learns a valuable lesson about love and home. Like, you're not doing that. Like, there's this, and nobody, I don't think in either of our books, nobody comes out and has like, you know, there isn't this, what we might expect if you and I had written these books, say 50, 60 years ago, right? We might assume everything else is the same. There might be, like there is in Heart is a Lonely Hunter, like there might be a character who expounds, right, on, let me tell you what this is really about. Like, that happens in a lot of those books. And I don't think either of us is doing that. And yet both these books feel weirdly didactic to me, in that it's like, you cannot not come away from it and go, okay, I know what this was about. You know what I mean? So how do we do that, Adam? I don't know.
Great. High five. And I think maybe that's, you know, the key component of the eco-Gothic, is that it teaches a lesson without, you know, openly doing that. But yeah, I think maybe it's because both of us kind of went into
knowledgeable reader. Is that what we're doing?
Yes, we just did it again. But yeah, I think, and part of it is that we went into it with like a goal greater than just like, I want to tell story of people, and I would just keep it contained to that. It's like, you want to get the environment, the world, the culture, and like culture nature divide, like let's smush that all together. We're a product of our environment in a lot of ways, and like just getting that, you're going to get the story and I guess lesson of the place, or just like the weird complication of the place is going to come out.
Or maybe we're just capturing the zeitgeist somehow. That I don't think you and I are alone in having these anxieties and having these kind of larger global thoughts about even small actions of individual people. And I don't think you and I are alone in this concept of, the self as part of an environment. I think that's very much, I think that's how a lot of young people, especially now, think of their presence in the world. So maybe this is like a growing, maybe this is something that people are saying. What would be an interesting question as people are watching is if people can think of other books that kind of do the same thing that have come out recently. Like, who else is getting this tattoo? Like, what other writers do we need to recruit into this movement? I would be really interested in if people have thoughts about that, especially if there's something you've read really recently. But what's interesting also, and maybe this answers the question I was asking you, is I think when you do start with these like big ideas that you want to convey, it almost kind of naturally strips away a lot of the clutter where, well, I want to write about this, the death of the most diverse ecosystem on the planet, right? Well, it's just going to be about this one lady at her church, right? Like all this other stuff did it kind of naturally fall away to just, because I would assume you started out with a lot more characters or a lot more ideas. Did it come to you really pared down, I guess is what I'm asking.
The more I worked on it, the more it kind of, I think, wedged towards the idea of the big, like, environment and crisis. Like, there's a hurricane in the book. It's in South Louisiana. It's a very natural thing. And my lovely fiance, Donnie, is like totally responsible about it. I was like wanting some kind of wildfire thing. And she's like, no, just you flood all your other stories. Why don't you just do that with your story in like South Louisiana? I'm going to leave the beautiful wildfire stories to you, Leah, actually. But like the more I worked on it, the more it kind of just continued. It was a really easy book to write, which is not like the thing people want to hear from an author, where they're like, oh yeah, this one came out like real easy. They're like, no, we want to see you sweating and like, suffering for this.
That's good.
Yeah, but it just really fit into this narrative as it went along. Just really fit into a lot of things that I'm feeling, that friends and family are feeling, and like leaning into those like eco-gothic tropes or that kind of framework just felt really comfortable and natural and poignant.
Yeah, and I think you've made it's clear. Probably the reason that it came out so easily is because you're probably doing a lot of subconscious and pre-drafting work where you're making good decisions. Like it's a great concept it's a great premise. Like you have, and I think you made the right choices in terms of when it's set, also not just where. So yeah, when we make those good decisions early on, I think it does come out easier. And then you get to find out what happens. That's my favorite part, is when I come up with a good idea and a good character, and then I, like the first draft, I get to be the first one who hears that story. I don't know what's going to happen either. Do you have this where it's like, oh, cool, then what happens? And is that kind of what you're talking about?
Mostly I like try to map it all out, and then I find out that I was wrong.
Well, yeah. Oh, really? Like, what do you mean?
Like, I am just like, I guess I'm like a nervous writer, and I love having the outlines and I fill in the blanks. And I heard like Nabokov, like one time I heard he like makes a postcard for each, page of his book, and he writes the book before he writes it. And he's better than me. So I can't do that. But yeah, I get halfway through and I realize like, oh, it needs to be a hurricane.
Yeah. That's so interesting. No, I love the discovery. I love the like, okay, let's see what happens. And, I like to follow, at least when I'm first starting. And then I think about all this big stuff later. Did anybody put in the comments any writers that they thought might kind of fit into what we're talking about? Or if not, that's okay. We can.
We don't have any yet.
They're slacking. It's okay.
That's okay. Well, I mean, maybe we're the first ones to do it. There's some wonderful, obviously there's wonderful eco-criticism out there and wonderful books that are engaging with a lot of the same environmental issues, but I think specifically writers that are placing things in the South and in ecosystems that have been threatened. I think that's basically what we're talking about. Do you have a favorite character, or do you have somebody that or do you have a character that didn't make it into the book that you wish had stayed?
Gosh, I will say there's this. I like, you talk about any character, and I'll be kind of telling you they're my favorite ones. There's some strange ones in here. There's the Norse god Odin, who's just, he's one of my favorite characters. I love like the villain in this novel, the horrible monster. I see a lot of myself in him, which isn't a good thing. And
okay, I don't need to know that.
Sorry, but yeah, just kind of this in the obsession, like the obsession of a writer and trying to figure out like what's in the walls. I felt very much like him trying to write what this girl's doing in the walls. It was, but I also love these kids. It's like a lot of kids in this novel, and there's this joy in just going back to that kind of experience you had as a kid and just experiencing a house. Do you have like characters that, like, when you're thinking of like fuckface, where you're just like, oh my gosh, I just want to hang out with this person?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you the reason I asked that question, and I will say I love your villain, and part of what I love about your villain is his obsessiveness, and how weirdly sympathetic I am to him, which is so hard to do with a villain, where like it's so, it's so weird. He's so weird, but also you get it. And when you think about it in terms of these larger concepts we're talking about, it's like, yeah, of course that would be the person who would become the antagonist in a story like this, right? It's completely understandable, but it's so strange, and yet this is the thing I love about this book, is it's so strange, and yet you're kind of reading along, going, well, yeah, that would happen. Yeah, that would happen, right? So anyway, the reason I asked about characters was because the other thing that I think, and I don't know how this fits in with the whole eco-gothic thing, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, maybe you can help me, is I notice animals in both our books, as characters, as like kind of having almost speaking parts. And can you talk a little bit about that, about the importance of animals in this book? In your book?
Yes, and I'm talking to you about it because, I mean, you got a frog on your book.
Yeah, frog on the cover. Like, yeah. I loved it when you read your passage about frogs. I was like, I like frogs.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. There's a story in here called Frogs, and there's absolutely beautiful and wonderful. I love animals and stories for just a couple of reasons. Like for this, I thought they were a great way to kind of expand the experience of the house. You get these other perspectives of the house, these other things, experiencing the house, and also just in general, like I feel like animals make a narrative richer. They just make it more realistic, like in our everyday life. Like if we're hanging out inside, purely quarantine, we're still experiencing animals. There's a spider web up here, like there's all sorts of these kind of permeations. I use that wrong, but like the house is so permeable. There's these kind of bugs and stuff coming in here, and I think we've got a cat who's hopefully making an appearance. Exactly, this creature. But like to write narratives that are just completely animal devoid, the brilliant stories that do that, obviously, but it almost seems more realistic when there is kind of these animal and non-human perspectives. Do you feel that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I notice in your work is that they're I don't want to say godlike, but they're observers, they are sort of the eyes in the woods, and that there's we open with that cat in the basement. That's like the very first thing, right? One of the first images in the book is her following this cat that's also in the house, and so there's a mirroring there between the animals and the people, which I think is similar to what I do, that I see, and maybe this is like, I guess it is part of that whole environmental ecological writing that we're talking about, because I see, I talk about this all the time, like I have this very kind of human relationship with the animals. Like I talk to the bears in my yard. My cat is currently on my desk eating my notes. That's why my laptop is bouncing a little. Sorry about that. But I see that as it makes total sense to me that if the environment isn't a character, if it's just like the engine and the central tension of the story, well, then the characters must also not just be human if we're talking about these environmental themes, right? And there must also be something that those non-human characters are doing and serving a purpose in the work. And so I have a lot of dead animals in my book. Like, you keep yours alive. I kill most of mine, which is unfortunate, but a girl's gotta convey her theme. So, but yeah, I think some of my favorite characters in your book are the birds, and some of my own favorite characters are my my dogs and my cats and my bears and my squirrels and stuff.
I just popped back on real quick. Hi. You guys have been absolutely fantastic. I think everyone is just really enjoying the conversation so far, and just you guys are answering questions as you went. I wrote down a few to ask, and then you guys answered them as I went.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I don't have any questions yet. I did have one that I wrote down that I wanted to ask you guys, and then maybe let you continue talking for a little bit, if that's okay. And if anybody does have questions, please ask. I want to make sure we get to everyone, so I want to have time for questions. I wanted to ask you both, actually. You were talking about being very direct in your writing and kind of directly approaching some difficult issues. And one of the issues, I think, is in Adam's book, maybe, is like fear of the unknown. I think is kind of a little bit of a theme. And I think you directly approach that. And in Leah's, I think it's just things that most people are normally a little bit uncomfortable talking about, maybe like the title of your book. First, as we mentioned, some people are willing to say it, some people aren't. So did you address that directly on purpose? Like, were you trying to kind of make people a little bit uncomfortable so that they would think about this more in the way that you approached it? Like, you really wanted people to think about these kind of uncomfortable, sometimes horrific topics? Or is that just like natural for you and that's the way you decide to write?
I do think there's something natural about me that just wants to make people uncomfortable. No, I think this was very much like I was kind of much like the villain in this novel. I was kind of obsessed about my own anxieties and what made me uncomfortable, and it was fun to kind of fall down this rabbit hole of like, like what if the bump in the night is like there, and like what if you are in this book, it's like what if you are the bump in the night. But it ultimately like was a way, after this book I ended up like a lot less scared of like weird noises in the house I hear at night than before it, which in a weird way, so like in this way of like dealing with the discomfort, I actually kind of like got over it, although we'll see if that lasts.
I really loved that aspect of your book, so thank you. I love the direct approach and just like feeling that with the author a little bit, so I really liked that.
And the narration, I think, really helps with that in Adam's book too, that we're so close with her that we have to just engage with these really difficult subjects. Like you can't turn away from it, right? You're stuck on the wall with her. I am a potty mouth, so that was a natural thing. Anyone who knows me knows that I have a little bit of problem with that, or is it a problem? But I did very intentionally, like there are certain things in the book that I felt like there were stories that I wanted to write about and characters I wanted to use that I felt like I never see. Like one of the things that happens in this book is, well, and this is in Twitchell, actually, the story that Adam mentioned, nobody talks about menopause, like graphically. And it is, I think, the most horrifying and hilarious thing that happens to any human is the process by which you go insane and your entire body breaks down and then you become a witch. Like, that's great, right? Why are there's a lot of metaphorical menopause in literature, but nobody ever goes, okay, well, this is what her period was like. And so I very intentionally wanted to have stories where I was talking about things that you usually look away from, and like things that like normally you'd be interested in the larger story rather than the checker at the supermarket, right? So I was interested in the secondary and the tertiary stuff. So yeah, very intentional, I think, for me.
And there's so much tenderness done with like these, taboo subjects where you're reading it and it doesn't feel like it's taboo. It's like, no, this is life. We should be talking about this. And I'm really feeling that.
I hope so.
I think that's really important. I love that about both of your work. So thank you for answering. Did you have a reading or anything you wanted to do, Leah, or did you guys want to keep talking?
I would love, since we've been talking so much about
okay.
Leah's work, it would be good to, if someone's not familiar with her work, just to get a little taste of it. Yeah.
I'll read a quick thing from Boomer, which is a story about a squirrel, since we're talking about animals. It's really about a firefighter. So this is a story the whole thing takes place in the fall of 2016, which is during the election when Trump was winning, right? And one of the things that people don't talk about when it comes to Appalachia is the fact that while the election was going on, there were these really huge forest fires that just raged all through Appalachia's forests. And so we were really not thinking that much about the election in 2016, even though everybody outside seemed to think that we were, and that we were somehow responsible for Trump. And we were like, he's not even from here. My house is on fire. So I wrote this story. So I'm just going to read a section where we have a firefighter who's going out at night to try to fight these forest fires. Let's see. By mid-October, he had forgotten what day it was. He stayed in Helm County, kept an eye on Hollow Rock. His team set prescribed burns. They pulled back tons of underbrush, cleared out the carpet of leaf litter and ripe tinder for miles of home ground. Masks covered their faces, so they spent entire days in woods they had hunted since childhood, nodding and signaling to each other like pitchers and catchers. Sparks multiplied. Larry worked. Above Highway 9, he helped cut dozer lines in the dusty earth to stop the front marching down from the north. He corralled volunteers, surveyed, soaked the ground. Skip a part there. Blazes fumed up like signals from the peaks, and the sky for 50 miles in any direction was a low tarp of ash. Volunteers streamed in, and October tumbled quietly out of control. The governor released the National Guard. FEMA set up evacuation stations up and down the Blue Ridge. None of this made the news. When he could get away, Larry would drive home, shower, eat, crash. In his sleep, he heard the thrum of helicopters making retardant drops. He switched from day shifts and went out into the night. Not that it mattered. Either way, he was gone for days at a time. He slept while his wife was awake. He fought fire while she slept. Night work suited him. He could see the enemy and nothing else. He could focus. Larry fought for Hollow Rock every night through November. The teams were just barely staying ahead of the threats, which were legion, fierce, and scattered. First, they prayed for rain. When rain didn't come, they prayed for smoke, the death of wind, a cold fog to choke oxygen, douse sparks. Instead, the clear fall weather gave the blazes air, feeding every small hell. The forest went cinematic at night, and lit slithers of amber inching in chiaroscuro through the trees and blackness. Millions of orange cinders floated around Larry perpetually in the dark. Fire likes to jump, to send out emissaries. Each night, more ignited dander and duff swirled and arced over the ditches they dug and above the disused logging roads they used for lines of defense. Embers burned bright and small, like sprites carrying the news of fire. Larry wheezed inside his mask. His breath echoed and pulled hotly on his upper lip. Even masked, he could taste the firebrands in the scorched air. They were lighted wicks uncandled, unbound tendrils eating themselves. They passed delicately in front of him, seeking hosts. When it was quiet, when no one was shouting, Larry heard the trees recoil. Branches crackled, trunks creaked and flinched from the bite of flame. Most of the embers burned themselves out, dissipating into charred vapor. Some he swatted or stomped. The ones he couldn't reach, the few that caught a wind, continued on in the thick ether above the forest, eventually coming to rest on fresh, dry victims in the distance.
Yes. Awesome. I love that passage. I read it for the first time like a year ago, and I've thought about it like almost every day. Like it's so good.
Thanks.
Visceral. I
Yeah.
love that. Thank you.
So, fund the National Park Service and buy our books.
Well, and I did put a link to buy Leah's book if you want to hear more of that story in the chat there. And Adam's is, of course, on the bottom. We did have a question. I know we're at an hour. Do you mind if I ask you guys a question?
Okay.
Are you okay, Leah?
Okay. Yeah,
we had one pop up while you were reading, and I didn't want to interrupt there. But let's see. He asked, earlier you mentioned that both books are in a ways didactic, or at least that you want the readers to come out of the reading experience with a strong sense of what they were supposed to take from the books. Did either of you ever consider taking a more morally neutral voice in your writing? And if so, how did you come to the decision not to do that?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. No. I don't want my forest to burn. So I decided that I was just going to be really, well, that's not true. I mean, like, Adam, you have a villain, like I said, who's very sympathetic, don't you think? I mean, I feel like I think we're neutral on a lot of stuff. Like, I don't think we're beating people over the head. Do you?
No, I don't think so either. And I think it just kind of like if it is clear and it's just completely straightforward, you lose that quality of the strange. And I think by both of us being strange, there's this kind of implication that it's not completely clean. And I like that question a lot, Carrie. Thank you so much. Yeah, because it's generally something you're taught is to kind of avoid these didacticism, but I think some of these best books that we talk about for years and even just the ones that just gonna pop up and we love them. I think there's didacticism even in them. It's just like really strange looking, so you don't necessarily recognize it at first.
Yeah, well, and you and I both also have complicated protagonists. Like, they're not entirely sympathetic. We're both writing about people who are not making great decisions. So even though sort of the mission of the book is maybe preset for us as writers, there is I think there's a lot of room for the reader to be like, I don't know, she still cheated on her husband, or whatever.
Yeah, and it's hard to think of just like a singular lesson, like don't live in walls. I don't know, it kind of worked out for her for a while. So yeah, but I think the big thing I'm really passionate about is like this environment's disappearing. South Louisiana's disappearing, and yeah, while it might be really good for the fish that would replace us, like I'm not on their side. Like I want the stuff that's here to stay.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you say so much too, I think, without coming out and saying it about family and about maturing and coming into one's sense of self. So I think that's a big reason that we haven't talked about that is another compelling reason to read the book.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think that kind of bounced off my question about directness a little bit. And I love how you are direct in addressing issues, but you're still giving the reader room to think about what they consider and whether they agree with the characters and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Really special because it gives them a lot to think about. So, well, it's after 8, so I didn't want to keep you guys too long, but thank you for answering our questions, and your conversation is just incredible. I loved every minute of it, and I'm sure our attendees did too. So thank you both for your time and for taking the time to talk to us and prepare for this and share your books with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us. We love
Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right, well, we'll say goodnight, and if you need anything, just let us know anytime, and we hope to see you back for future books.
Yeah, let's get to work.
Oh my God. We love both of you guys.
Second book is hard.
Well, you guys are incredible at it, so keep it up. Thank you. All right, good night, everybody.
Take care.
See you guys. Thanks for coming out, guys.
Congrats, Adam.
Appreciate it.